The 2025 webinar series, Saving the Sacred, is the result of public input during our state planning process. Today's session, Cemetery Research and Recordation, is a second of a three-part series focusing on cemetery preservation. Our speaker today is Jason Harpe. Jason is the public historian and director of cemetery conservation with Grubb and Associates. He has over 25 years of experience in the field of historic preservation in both the public and private sectors. He leads workshops on cemetery preservation for historical societies, student groups, museums, churches, and historic preservation organizations, in addition to conserving gravestones and monuments of diverse types in family, church, and municipal cemeteries. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great. Thanks, Lynda. It's an honor and a privilege to be doing this again. I love doing these presentations, and I'm very happy to be doing the second installment. As Lynda mentioned, the title of the presentation is called Saving the Sacred, Cemetery Research and Recordation. I have the good fortune of working all along the East Coast, as far up as Maine and as far down as Mississippi and Louisiana. So I get to see a lot of different cemeteries and get to learn a lot and to meet a lot of interesting people. Our company, Grubb and Associates, is a cultural resource management firm with our main office in New Jersey. We have an office in Philadelphia, Nashville, Tennessee, and Wake Forest, North Carolina. I also have the good fortune of, I'm not really ever going into an office, but I do have to spend a lot of time on the road. I just showed this slide to give you some idea of the links that we go to within safe means to do some recording in cemeteries. Sometimes that involves moving some stones, which I do not encourage unless you're someone who has experience doing it, as well as addressing stones that may be leaning or are damaged. So my mission today with this presentation is to, because I do not know what level those in attendance may be. You may be starting out at square one on floor one, or you may be a seasoned researcher and someone who's done a lot of recording in cemeteries. So my goal is to give you some, if you're just starting out, a lot of resources that you could consult as part of your cemetery journey, if you will, your cemetery research journey. And for those who may have been doing it for a long time, maybe there's one or two things in my presentation that will be helpful to you, as well as equipping you with some tools if you haven't started, or if you have started, like I said, maybe just a few additional things that you have not thought of. And I use the two words, start and continue, and never finish, because honestly, I feel like this journey is never finished. There's always someone to research that is a little elusive. There may be a cemetery that you found documented somewhere that you just can't find, and you're not sure why, or if it's gone, and why is it gone. So I feel like there's a lot of research with each project. And some throughout my presentation, I will make reference to some journeys of some people who were friends of mine, as well as colleagues, and help exemplify this point that the journey never ends. So a few disclaimers in the beginning. I will not have time to cover everything. I can't overemphasize enough the importance of you reaching out to me after the presentation. If you have some questions, I would love to get your questions, because again, there's no way I can cover everything. The resources I do provide in this presentation, a lot of them come from my professional or personal research, although there are some examples from some colleagues or friends who have worked on projects, who know that I'm always trying to build this cache of photographs and examples to really help folks through my presentations who are facing a variety of different types of situations. Just a little note about my usage of the word grave marker. We use it as one word and not two. I want to make sure you know that, so you know that I actually do know how to spell. And throughout the presentation, I give credit when I can for photographs or documents or things of that nature that were supplied to me by others, or photographs that I did it myself. In addition to reaching out to me with questions, on things that I may not have covered, please share with me some examples from your work. I'd love to see them. I feel like a lot of examples can go a long way in the future to helping folks who may be dealing with the same types of things that you're dealing with, or have you've got a success story that you may be able to share with someone else who's not at the point that you're at that time. There are a few other avenues, resources that there's just not enough time to address, but I'm more than happy to talk with you about it afterwards, or send me an email. Those are oral histories, very, very important from a public history standpoint, in gaining more knowledge about your cemetery and the people buried in the cemetery. Photogrammetry is another great resource. It's not really a buzzword right now. The reason I'm not showing any slides is I've actually done some photogrammetry through an app on my phone, and I just stopped doing it, so I don't have a lot of great examples. But again, I can, and in our industry, my work, honestly, we just don't do a lot of photogrammetry right now. Probing surveys, which we don't really encourage, but some cemeteries who have more of an organized effort with professionals involved are undertaking those as well. I'm a firm believer in hard copies. That makes me a little bit of a dinosaur. I do believe that we should use digital, use online, but the paper copies go a long way. And I know that folks who receive these paper copies are not probably excited that I'm mentioning this, but I like to use both. And one good example is working in areas where we're using, say, an iPad, and it's so hot outside that the iPad shuts down. If I had not had those paper copies, I would have been out of luck. I probably will not be able to provide every potential resource in your respective city or county in your state. But what I've done is I've tried to pull together, and I'll talk a little bit about it, some resources that I found online literally in a matter of 5 to 10 minutes before this presentation. I can't overemphasize, when you're doing your recordation, do not attempt to move or relocate or turn over large grave markers that may be displaced or damaged. Just do the best you can with whatever situation that grave marker or that monument is in. When you're doing your recordation, and if you cannot read the stone and you're trying to figure out a way to do that, just use water and a soft bristle brush to clean off some of the biofilm or the biological growth. Do not use chalk. Do not use shaving cream. Don't use cooking flour. They're just not good for the stone, and we don't recommend it. In reference to my next point, going back to what I said about searching within 5 to 10 minutes and finding so much, I feel like cemetery research and recordation has never been easier. You just Google it and call your local historical society, and a lot of times all of what you need can be found relatively quickly, even though I did say the search never ends, but that can at least get you started on your journey. So today I'm going to talk about a lot of these different resources, and again, I'm sure there are some that are not included on my list, and if you've been fortunate enough to find a resource that's not on this list, I'd love to hear about it. So I'm going to go through some of these, and I'm going to give you some examples. So state cemetery survey forms, if you live in a state, not sure where everybody's from, but if you live in a state that actually does have cemetery survey forms that are available for both, say, the cemetery lover, it's not in the profession, so both types. And if you don't, there are a lot of great resources that are available online, great examples of cemetery survey forms that you can kind of take and pick and choose which areas, how detailed if you're considering doing a citywide or a countywide cemetery survey, you may not need as detailed of an overall cemetery survey form, because you may not be inventorying everything that's in that specific cemetery, where if you are doing that for one cemetery, there are forms available online. And again, if you can Google it, but if you want, you can email me as well, and I can send you some examples that we've pulled from state agencies, from some professional contacts as well, and we can help you there. Sometimes in countywide architectural survey folders, there's quite a bit of information. If you get lucky, there's a lot of great information, and I'm going to show you an example of that. Obviously, your State Historic Preservation Office and your Office of State Archaeology. And if you do reach out to these offices, please be patient with the staff. They a lot of time are understaffed and overworked. So please just be patient with those folks. Also, environmental review reports, in many cases, are historic structure survey reports can contain a great bit of information as well. WPA surveys, Work Progress Administration, their surveys can be really helpful if you're missing you think you're missing some stones in a cemetery that like right now, and if you go back to those WPA surveys, you may be able to find out that those gravestones were there in the late 30s and 40s. So again, it's another piece of the puzzle to help you navigate through your journey. If you're doing genealogy these days, these are sources that are not new to you. But if you're just starting out, these are fantastic online resources that you can end up going down a rabbit hole that will last an entire weekend or more. But newspapers that are available online, Ancestry, Family Search, Find a Grave, Billion Graves. I've got another list of those as well that I'm gonna talk about in a few slides. And what do you find in those places? You find obituaries, you find death certificates. Sometimes you can find, say, if you have a small family cemetery, there are notices in the newspapers about a family reunion. And after the family reunion, after everyone's belly's full, they go out to the cemetery to do some work in the cemetery. So there's a lot of times there's a lot of good information you can find. Topo maps, topographical maps also can be a really great resource for our company and companies like ours if we're doing a big survey of an area, like if it's like in the mountains of North Carolina or somewhere similar to that, and you're trying to determine what all potential resources are in that project area. Many times you can find cemeteries denoted on a topo map, and they may only say the CEM, but at least that gives you a note to actually check that out in that specific location. Sanborn maps, I'm going to show some examples of these, and other types of maps as well. I've got some examples. And a lot of times these maps are public and private repositories. I'm going to give you one example because I made notes before the presentation. And this example is not specifically for cemeteries, but it relates to maps and aerial photographs. I'm involved with a project, and this specific county does not have their like 1938 aerial photographs available online. So I called their local history room and found out that there was an amazing collection of aerial photographs that a gentleman who, after World War II, used the the government funding to actually study photography. And when he came home, he flew around the county and took aerial photographs. It was amazing. So again, I'll say this many times throughout the presentation: check with your local historical societies and genealogical societies, because a lot of times their collections, inventories, and cataloging is not available online. But if you have someone with that organization who has the institutional memory, can save you a lot of time and provide some great resources. Photographs as well. I've got some of those in here. Sadly, not all photographs in everyone's collections are available online. So again, it's a good idea to make a call or shoot an email just to see if there's something that you're not finding online. Funeral home records. These are fantastic if the funeral home has been around for quite some time, has kept their records, and would be willing to share those records with you if it's related to a family member or something like that. And I have some great examples of how these funeral home records have been very beneficial to some academic projects. Your deeds in your in other city and county records that may not be available online, so it's a good idea to check with your register of deeds or clerk of court if they're just to see if there may be something that they have that's not available online, or if the inventory is not available online or anything about the materials at all. Postcards, a lot of times, I've got an example to show you, can be great resources. Say a postcard from the early 20th century shows a specific area of the cemetery that has changed over the course of a number of years, and it can help you understand the changing of the landscape of your specific cemetery. Primary sources like original letters written between family members, journals kept by people in the community, people on the county or state level. can be unbelievable resources for you. Records of a local monument company. I have not been very successful in my pursuits with say local monument companies maintaining records, but or at least getting access to them. So it's just another resource that you might check if you're hitting a roadblock. If a burial association that you learn about, it may not exist any longer, but if you can find a descendant who, I always say never count out the possibility of a photograph or some kind of documents existing. You just have to ask. Also, fraternal organizations like your local Sonic Lodge. If you know for a fact that someone you're searching for, or was a member of the lodge, there may be something. And I have an example to show you as well. And again, kind of coming back to what I said early on, your local history room at your library can a lot of times be such an unbelievable resource. So I'm going to show you some examples now of those forms that I mentioned. These are the North Carolina forms, as you can imagine. I work with these quite regularly. If we have tailored some of our survey forms to mimic or emulate what our Office of State Archaeology, our cemetery specialists within our Office of State Archaeology has done. This is an actual historic structure data sheet from a countywide architectural survey. This is an example, and the last example is of a WPA survey of a cemetery in a nearby town to where I live. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I've been able to find from these various resources. This is a fantastic mid-19th century Presbyterian church that has fortunately not endured too many changes other than being painted, we think, in the 1940s or 50s. I was fortunate enough to be involved in writing the National Register nomination for this because I'd done a lot of research. So one of the first things that I did, even though this is located close to where I live and I knew a lot about it already, is inquired with the State Historic Preservation Office for the survey site file for this church and the cemetery as well, not knowing what might be in that file. Luckily, within that file, I had forgotten about some photographs submitted with what's in North Carolina called a state study list application before pursuing the National Register nomination, which contained earlier photographs of the cemetery, of the church before it was painted, as well as some of the grave markers for some of the more well-known individuals who are buried in that cemetery. Also within the file was information from the minute I think 1840s and 50s, which I had never seen before. I never even thought to look for them, as well as a newspaper article which basically explained that at one point the Presbyterian Church was thinking of getting rid of, if you will, or selling, the church and cemetery, and locally a local organization stepped up to help lead the church, to save the church and to lead future efforts at preservation of both the church and the cemetery. Geological surveys, in many cases, can be pretty fantastic resources if they exist, if you find them. This is one, for an example, in New Jersey of a historic site there where fortunately they were able to produce a lot of these surveys. So, we were able to find the location of a cemetery that has something happened to half of the cemetery, but we at least know that it's there. Historic maps, if you're fortunate enough that your cemetery is located in an area where there might have been a town map, this is a plan map for Oil City in Pennsylvania, and one of my colleagues actually found it on Etsy. So again, never count out the possibility of finding a resource in places that you may not think. Both Etsy, eBay, there are a lot of things that I have colleagues and friends who reach out to me regularly about that they've been able to find online. This is one of my favorites because this is something that I'm researching now. This is a town of Lincoln, North Carolina, where I live, and our local historical organization has this map from 1900 of right around our downtown. And I had seen that map for many years, but up until the last couple of years, I had not really, focused in on all the blocks, and then noticed that in one of the blocks, there is listed a potter's field. And the ironic part about this is that where this is located within our city, there is a Family Dollar parking lot that is sitting on that plot. And over the years, there have been numerous times where there have been collapsing asphalt within that parking lot. So again, pay close attention to those maps if you're fortunate enough to find them, or if your historical society has them. You may look at them 7 or 8, 10 times, but you go back the 11th, 12th time, you may find something that you didn't even know was there. The Sanborn maps, these are fire insurance maps. Some of you on here who are maybe has done a lot of research are familiar with the Sanborn maps, and they're helpful for numerous reasons. But from the perspective of cemeteries, they help show you if your cemetery has grown over the years. The Sanborn maps they did not come out every year, and sometimes there was a larger gap between the years than others. So that's another great resource if you haven't checked them out. And also plats, if you're doing deed research on your cemetery, and if you are looking around that property as well to see over the years what's happened, how that cemetery may have transformed. This is a great example of an African-American section. Well, it started out as an African-American family cemetery, but that eventually became a large municipal cemetery. So our company was involved with the National Register nomination, and of course we ended up nominating this cemetery. There were actually 3 different cemeteries that we ended up nominating as a district. Masonic lodges. The cemetery on your right is not an actual cemetery. The grave markers that are in that area were saved after the cemetery was destroyed. And as part of my work to try to help them with the research, one of the members whose grave marker is in this area, I remembered, because I am a member of our local lodge, remember that when members of the lodge, maybe not always, but in a lot of occasions when they passed away, depending on who was a member of the lodge at the time and who might have been writing it, you might find a quite detailed sort of a eulogy for that person that could again help you in your search with whether a person or them being buried in a cemetery. Find a grave. A lot of folks know about Find a Grave. Sometimes in our searches are very fruitful. Sometimes they're not. My example, and the reason I'm showing you this one specifically, is because one simple Find a Grave search turned into something that I never even thought would happen. This is an Episcopal Church cemetery that has in North Carolina that does have a few Union soldiers buried who died while in our specific city. And I had searched before and didn't find much on some others who may be buried in the cemetery, but would go back periodically to check and found that someone related to this gentleman, Daniel Youngs, had added this daguerreotype in addition to other information, which I'm not going to read all of this information, but this detailed information about his story, as well as indications that, not indications, but other information about a surgeon who was there at this specific location and had documented when he was shot or when he died and he was buried at that cemetery. This is part of that surgeon's journal that does say Daniel Youngs, and I think it says buried at Lincolnton. Yeah. So again, while you may, periodically, it's a good idea to go back to see if anyone has added additional information for individuals buried within a specific cemetery. This is another example. This is an institutional cemetery, and many of the grave markers within the cemetery are simply marked with the initials and the number that person when they were admitted to this specific hospital. And luckily, the Find a Grave entries for this institutional cemetery are quite fantastic. They've got a lot of great information. I don't know exactly who's added all this information, but it's really good. So again, find a grave is one that a lot of folks think about and go to first. I guess what I'm saying to you is if you don't find much the first time you go there, the second time you go there, you may be surprised at subsequent visits to that specific memorial or that cemetery, what you might yield. These are some other sources that I'll tell people that I have 2 computer screens that I work from when I'm doing work from my office. And a lot of these are tabs that I keep open all the time because they're sources that we would use on a regular basis. Those are Billion Graves. There is a resource that I learned about recently called Nationwide Gravesite Locator for the VA looking for veterans. Family Search. We're fortunate in North Carolina. I'm not sure about Oklahoma and other states that over the years, we've had a lot of volunteers who have helped digitize our state's estate files, like mostly historic estate files. So we have Family Search. We use Family Search a lot because we're looking at those estate files. The Jewish Gen Cemetery Database, Commonwealth War Graves for war memorials and war cemeteries, politicalgraveyard.com, internment.com, Tombstone Transcription Project, Cemetery Office. You can also, as a resource, would be checking with if it's a cemetery that has, if it's its own organization and they have a home office there on site, and if they have a sexton on staff that may be able to help you, as well as Google. That's where I start. It's just go to Google and see what I can find right out of the gate. So I'm going to show you some more examples of where you might not think you will be successful. This is in that same cemetery at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in Lincolnton, where I showed you for Daniel Young's. This is the grave marker for, on the stone, it says Captain George French, but actually he was a colonel. And as a member of the local historical association, I found in one of their newsletters that someone had written to the organization talking about their research into Colonel French, and he provided additional information. And so for many years, folks that I know who are lifelong researchers had never really taken the dive into Colonel French's background, but just within a historical organization newsletter was able to find a lot of information about this individual. Newspapers, fantastic resource. If you're fortunate, your local newspapers have been digitized and are available on newspapers.com. If not, there may be a municipality, a township, a city nearby who may publicize some things that can be helpful in your journey. This is for an African American cemetery that has over 1,800 interments that have been documented by the Friends organization, but has less than 300 extant grave markers. And they were able to find an article from the 1890s that someone had visited this cemetery and had pointed out or had commented to the reporter that a lot of the grave markers were made of wood. They don't say exactly what type of wood, but they were made of wood, which leads us to believe that they have rotted or were stolen over the years, and that's why there are so few extant grave markers to match the actual number of decedents that they've documented being buried in the cemetery. Historic photographs, can't say enough about these. In my research journeys, I've been fortunate in some cases to find them. This example is actually from a newspaper, and the reason I'm showing this example this is a fantastic statuary piece in Jackson, Mississippi, for an African American congressman during Reconstruction. And while we were doing work there, we found basically scraps of cast iron or wrought iron fencing. We were trying to get a better understanding of the landscape, and after doing research in the newspapers, we're very happy to find this photographs that shows more about what the landscape looked like from probably the late 19th century, early 20th century. Another great photograph that we were able to find for a second really fantastic statuary piece in that same cemetery that shows, this is actually behind it is the campus of Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. And it those the pre-buildings at Jackson State on this side of the cemetery were basically sort of small, almost small, American small houses or just small bungalows. So another, probably one of my favorite photographs of an individual whose family had a monument company in our small town, and in addition to the photograph, the family also donated to the local museum his mallet and his chisels, and we were able to find the grave marker that's shown here in the historic photograph. So, as you might be able to tell, I love historic photographs of cemeteries. If you can find them, it's great. This is just another example, stereoscope view of Titusville Cemetery, or Woodlawn Cemetery in Titusville, PA. They're great on their own, but especially if you can compare them to a current view. And I know this part we're talking about research, but in terms of recordation, we believe very strongly that recordation just doesn't apply to the grave markers themselves. It also applies to the landscape, and the landscape being the trees, walls, steps, statuary pieces, roads, all types of things, streams, ponds, that should be recorded as part of your journey through research and recordation. That can be invaluable to folks who are doing this, maybe researching your cemetery in years to come. This is a postcard example for a project we worked on, the one I showed you earlier, that we really didn't, when we were trying to understand the landscape of the cemetery, because over the years it had been enlarged quite a number of times. The main entrance, which you can see in the photograph or the postcard, was changed. Able to find this postcard, and actually when we found it, we weren't sure exactly which perspective we were looking at until further investigation. We were able to figure out the elevation that we were seeing based on a mausoleum on the property. Another example of a great postcard image of a cemetery in Pennsylvania that again helps you understand the development of the landscape. Estate files. I've used this before. Again, even if your estate files are not available online, but you have to go to the state archives to look for them. Sometimes you get really, really fortunate, and there's more in the estate file, kind of like the survey file that I mentioned earlier. This great example here is a grave marker for a person that died in the 1840s, and a good friend of mine who knew I was working in the cemetery, who's a great genealogist, and she was doing work before any of this stuff was digitized. I just had a conversation with her about it, and she explained to me she had actually pulled this estate file some years ago and then had it at home in her collection. So she reached out to me, and it basically, there's a receipt in the estate file from September 5, 1843 that actually lists who the stonecutter was for this grave marker, the price of it, and also the price of the coffin and who supplied it, but also a receipt from actually less than a year later for paying someone who actually did the mending on this grave marker. So these cast iron straps are 180 years old now and still in really good shape. So another estate file that proved to be invaluable to us, we did conservation on these box tombs, and we were able to find in the estate file not only which company supplied these marble tablets, but also that at one point there was a stone enclosure around the cemetery, which a number of local organizations are they're planning to put back. So again, back to understanding the entire landscape and not just the grave markers. Church records are kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes churches have them on site. Sometimes they may be, depending on your denomination, they may be at a larger facility that keeps these records, and but there may be some on the local level. But that's been my experience in a few cases that folks do have information on the local level, and you should always inquire about it. Journals and diaries. if you're a researcher, you read a lot of these, and I found in some of these letters and journals where they're talking about these folks who are in a lot of ways kind of chroniclers. What they do is they are writing and just documenting their daily lives, and in a lot of cases, they're not just documenting work or school or their business, but they're also documenting or talking about death and burial. This one in particular dates from 1852. A judge writes about after dinner he read a specific thing, and he writes about someone being buried. She was a young lady about 18 years old, and the last of 8 children, all of whom fell victims to, actually my screen's kind of small, actually consumption, I think. Her father is a physician and is practicing at the Lincoln factory, which was a mill, and he came south for her health, but in vain. She was not buried, but put into a vault of the Hope family and is to be taken north in a few years. He actually explains that she was laid in a tin coffin, which was encased with a very fine wooden, I think there was a slide in the glass that she was a viewing glass in the coffin, but that he never looked at. This is the actual tomb that he's referring to, that for many, many, many years, I actually attend the church that I attend. This is our cemetery. The church wanted the steps. What's out in front of it is actually 2 sides of the steps that lead down, which actually goes down 14 feet. And they've never seen any reference to this until a friend explained to me that he had read the judge's journal, and it was the only reference we'd ever seen to this family tomb. This is an example of a published journal from Charlotte, North Carolina, that is not specifically speaking about a grave marker, but more the young woman who's writing this is talking about the burial of enslaved people and explaining the actual funeral. Luckily, this journal, as you can see, is published, and not all of them are. So if you get lucky, you might find something in one of these resource of this type. One last example. This is an individual who actually wrote my master's thesis on, who was he was an unbelievable chronicler. He was involved with local politics. He was a county surveyor, and he kept journals nearly his entire life. And he does record on in 1881 about he was a teacher, so there are a number of days where he was just teaching school. And then for this entry, he writes about basically engraving a stone for this specific woman, and what he put on it. Sadly, I've searched for this and it's not there, so I don't know if he didn't finish it or what ended up happening to the stone. But I'm sure that journey will continue for me. These are resources that if you're really getting in the weeds for like grave marker types. At one point, Sears and Roebuck, Montgomery Ward actually sold grave markers, and you could buy them kind of like you can do on Amazon today. And you can find, in some cases, you can find a grave marker type that is you can document coming directly from one of these catalogs, and that's what we were able to do in this one example on the left. Also, another. If you're getting in the weeds and your cemetery has some fencing, there are resources online where you can find exact types of fencing that may be in the landscape of your cemetery. I just showed this example. This is there's a company that actually can fabricate sections of old fencing, and they were able to do that through photographs in addition to some existing sections of the cemetery. So this is where those types of resources really come in handy in your research as well. And being able to, the stewards of this cemetery have done a really good job of documenting that entire process from finding replicas of it and the fabrication and the installation. Something that a lot of folks don't think about is they do a lot of research, but they're not extremely organized. I can't take credit for this organized notes. a very, very smart and organized young architectural historian with our company. Almost everyone in our southern offices uses her. We actually call it the Heckendorf method. She is. I asked her if I could borrow some examples, and she told me that I could. And this is actually her notes from her genealogical research. Now, while it's not exactly related to cemeteries, it's just she just does such an amazing job. And it's, number one, it's helpful to be organized, and number two, if you have to set this aside, and if you're doing this as a hobby and you only have so much time to devote to it, and you have to set it aside and come back to it, if you have these organized notes, it makes things a whole lot easier to come back to this. And I'm more than happy to, if you're someone who's, I'm not as organized as Olivia is, but now I do use her, the Heckendorf method, in my research. So if you're interested in, I can share a blank set of this material, or the structure of this, if you're interested in it as well. Again, just another set of or extension of her notes on one specific ancestor who she's very frustrated with, and she's a good example of your research journey not ending. She's researching this ancestor and cannot find where this ancestor was buried. So going back to what I said in the beginning about Oklahoma, in using Google, and how it's much easier than it used to be to find resources. So what I decided to do was just right out of the gate, let me just Google Oklahoma cemetery resources. And one of the first things that came up was from the Oklahoma Historical Society. And so the slide you see here is just a screen grab of what's available, that can be helpful to you if you're, I think in every case, if you're someone who's researching an ancestor who may be buried in the cemetery, if you're a cemetery steward who's trying to research and document your specific cemetery and try to preserve it as part of your preservation effort, there are resources out there. And it's kind of like the information's out there. You just have to reach out and grab it. It's out there. And I did not use any search terms other than just Oklahoma cemetery preservation resources. This is another screen grab from the Oklahoma Historical Society's website on resources. I did check some specific examples in different areas that I'll show you in a few other slides to show you again what's available, but it's part of another section of the presentation. So the recordation part is super, super important. I mentioned to Lynda earlier, I actually had someone reach out to me today about standardized recordation, and there really isn't. I have been able to find that there are some materials related to standardized recordation in the UK and some other countries, because now if you go online and record a historic cemetery, there are a lot of different examples, and there are actually a few, but they're not really accepted as the standard method. So I guess that's good and bad on your journey. You have a lot of flexibility, and if you're doing this as a hobby versus professionally, and your state, if you're doing it professionally, your state may require you to do it a specific way. So again, it can be good and bad for you. This is just a photograph. Hard to believe that there's actually a photograph of me, because I'm always taking photographs of other people. But what I'm doing is in this photograph is actually recording grave markers within a cemetery where we're going to be doing conservation work. And what we're able to do from the iPad with this specific database, obviously, is search, heavy searches, add additional information after I'm out of the field, because within the field, I'm typically not trying to get GPS coordinates while out in the field. With an iPad, I'm usually carrying something that's more robust to get GPS. So I say I talk to a lot of people who say, I don't know what to do, or I'm going to do something. So you have to be careful, take your time, be intentional, but do something, because if you just keep putting it off, it's never going to happen. The photograph on the left is a great example of for me, a group, an organization who is working to preserve and care for their historic cemetery, There's not a lot of, they don't financially, they're not able to buy, lots of equipment. So what they decided to do is just start off, because there's no official, if you will, map of the cemetery that anyone's done in the past. That has, sections or rows and numbers. They just decided to start simple and just take these basic small stakes and laminate sections and then laminate the numbers. So that's, even if you have to start here, that's a place that you can start. The other photograph is just showing when you may be in a situation where you do have more resources, and the resources I'm referring to in particular is my boss actually out in the cemetery, getting really, really good coordinates for grave markers that can be used in the future for mapping efforts, if there's any geophysical surveys, things of that nature. This is, you can start out with a spreadsheet, and you can start recording within a spreadsheet, or you can, Google Docs. But, I just wanted to show this example because it doesn't have to be super detailed right out of the gate. Just get the information down. At some point, you may have enough time to go back and research your city directories to see where, if your cemetery, say into the 20th century, if you're interested in going into that detail, just get it down, get it in a spreadsheet. As I mentioned, as part of the recordation process, you may be involved with a cemetery that has a lot of historic trees. As I said, we're very interested in the landscape, and it's really important, if you don't have the financial resources to pay an arborist, maybe your local master gardeners can help you do this, but not only document the types of trees that are there, but also document the condition if you can. The trees, as well as if there are plants and plant types that may be specific, say culturally. These are yucca plants in African American cemeteries that are super important to document, because if at some point you have a crew that comes in to maintain that cemetery, they may have no idea what these are, and if they don't, it's highly likely that they're going to take a weed eater or a bush hog or something to these things, and they'll eventually grow back, but not if they keep doing this over the years. So it's very important that you understand your landscape as well, and what's within that cemetery. I showed this the last time as part of just kind of an overall historic preservation or preservation planning for cemeteries, is keep your eyes open while you're at the cemetery. And just another example of grave marker surveys. There's a lot of times there's just really, it's unbelievable what you can find. This is an example of a kind of a ubiquitous grave marker type in African American cemeteries that a colleague of mine was able to find. And we have for many years have talked about the need to figure out who is making these. These are like poured concrete grave markers. The typefaces all the same, and there are probably 4 different examples of funerary that's on these grave markers, like specific type, has an anchor on it. And she was actually able to find in an estate file the mention of Aiken, this grave marker being done by Aiken Stone Company out of South Carolina. It's just another good example. This grave marker has basically stamped into it in the concrete that it was provided by Carolina Funeral Home. And I imagine we haven't checked, but there is a chance that Carolina Funeral Home may still maintain some of their original records. Something else to keep in mind that you may not think about. There are a number of have sort of statewide cemetery histories that some of them provide details on stonecutters and marble yards and monument companies throughout the state. And there's something called backdating. It's actually something that's done today. If you have a relative who passes away and you don't put a grave marker out for 2 years, they're basically backdating it to the time that the person passed away. In this example, this grave marker here dates from the 1840s, or the person died in the 1840s, and at the bottom is the name of the marble yard where this exact marker came from. Well, they didn't actually start operating until the 1870s. So the folks who were involved with this cemetery had no clue. They just assumed, because again, they're not really familiar with grave marker types and what types and forms were used in, say, a specific time period. But I thought to look, because I just looked more to me like something from the late 19th century. So that's something to keep in mind. We're fortunate in North Carolina. I know New Jersey, Texas, a number of other states have sort of this statewide cemetery book, or we call it the Cemetery Bible. This is one we have from North Carolina that does document that individual and the marble yard, as well as some other details. So again, as part of the recordation process, keep these things in mind, because it's part of the full record of your cemetery and the grave markers inside the cemetery. We use database forms, as I said, as part of our when we are recording cemeteries for projects. This is Filmmaker Pro is what we use. It's not the only database. You can use Microsoft Access. This is just one that we've used that we're used to using. So I just wanted to show you an example. You may not be at a point where you want to use a database and you're just going to use a spreadsheet, which is fine. And also, as part of the recordation process, is mapping. If you can do that, even if you're doing mapping on Google Earth, or if you have an app on your phone, just be mindful. If you're very serious about getting exact points, it does take more advanced technology to get exact points. But again, going back to what I was showing you with the cemetery where they were doing they didn't have a lot of money, so they were just putting out stakes with rows and row numbers and section numbers. Try to get something, and just to as part of that journey again through your process. This is just an example of what you can do if you have a cemetery that does have this type of landscape. A lot may not. But you can do things when you as part of your research process, like if you've got historic trees, you can call these things out. I'm a conservator, but I'm also a public historian who believes strongly in educating the public about the history of your cemetery and your preservation efforts. And this is just a good example of one that I visited that it's an amazing on a number of levels. But they do a really good job of informing the visitors of the history of the cemetery, the landscape, and as well as their history of their efforts at that cemetery. As part of the recordation process, this doesn't happen a lot, but if you do in fact ever replace grave markers that are so far damaged that they look a mess, honestly. And it's better to put a replacement for this stone. And this one in the photograph is it's missing over half of it. It's a small thing, but it's part of that recordation process. Is at the bottom somewhere on that stone, make sure that you explain that this is not the original, that this is a replacement stone in the year that was replaced. Photography. This seems like a common sense thing, because this there's more text in this presentation than I do in a lot of presentations, because I know it's going to be made available online. So I'm just going to hit some high points with using photography as part of your recordation process. If you can, I know most, maybe not all, but most folks do have a smartphone with a camera. So it's we're in an interesting time where that for a lot of us that hasn't always been the case. If you do have a good quality SLR or DSLR digital camera, I do know your phones. You can take the photographs with your phone, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Please make sure you have your smartphone's camera set at a resolution that's somewhere that you're going to take photographs between, say, 5 and 8 megabytes. Another thing to keep in mind, I must admit, I'm an Android user. I have engage with a lot of folks who are iPhone users. So when they're taking photographs, I'm sure there's a setting for this, but when I've worked out of state and folks have taken photographs and they've texted them to me, they come through as blurry. Or if someone is reaching out to me about a project and they want to show me a photograph, if the photograph is so small, I can't see what's going on. So this is something, excuse the pun, but I harp on a lot is I'm a little particular about photographs, and I think everyone should be as part of your recordation process. Another thing is take tons of photographs, whether you are using an SLR or DSLR camera or your phone. It's a great time to be able to do this, where you can take thousands and thousands of photographs. Just don't let them store on your phone and lose them. There are ways to get them off of your phone if you've taken thousands and thousands of photographs. And then again, things that may seem like common sense. If there are people in the cemetery, don't take photographs of the grave markers while there are people walking behind them. If you can, take some supplies with you to help, and I'm going to go over a few, show some photographs. If you're really serious about it, invest in whether it's a flashlight or what's called a reflector. Or I know folks, and I don't have a photograph of this slide, is they actually take full-length mirrors to the cemetery to help reflect sun or light onto the face of the grave markers during their documentation process. A few others get a good tripod. I mentioned earlier, I think in the very beginning under the disclaimers, is that if you cannot read the what we call the attributes, which are the birth and death dates, the name, and the epitaph, carry a small water sprayer with a soft bristle brush. It's also helpful if you don't have a scale bar to just put in a coffee cup. It doesn't have to be Starbucks. Just put in a coffee cup or something for perspective into how large that grave marker is. And plan in advance, because as you know, nearly all cemeteries are oriented north to south and face east to, or east to west. Obviously, throughout the day, the sun's going to be hitting in a section early in the morning and another section later in the afternoon. So it's important to try to plan ahead. So I'm just going to show you some examples of what they're just it could have been done better. Obviously, you can't see what all's going on with this one. We can see that there's some damage with this, but it's not a photograph of the entire grave marker. The one on the right is one that I had actually conserved, or was planning or going to conserve. And what they've done is they've only taken a photograph of what we assume is genealogical purposes. If you are doing these types of things for genealogical purposes, take this photograph, yes, but also take other photographs so we can see other parts of the grave marker, other sides, other things that might be engraved on them. The one on the left, there's just not enough there for us to see all that's going on. And these are ones that I use, and they're not because I took them, but they are good examples of, in addition to being there at the right time, is taking them and not looking, only getting half of the stone. And again, this is not very difficult to do. It just takes a little practice. These are two other examples. One on the right is an example that was lit using a reflector. So the sun was shining on the back side of the grave marker, and she was able to use a reflector to reflect light onto the face. And you can actually see that in the stone. Not everybody's able to do geophysical surveys, but as an advanced recordation technique, there is a lot of people have heard of ground penetrating radar. There's magnetometry. There are LiDAR surveys. But again, I'm showing them to you as something to keep in mind in your journey after you've done, say, your in-field boots on the pavement recording on paper in a database. But there's still maybe more going on that you can't see by being there, that can be helpful to you underground, helpful to you in your research and recordation underground through, say, a ground penetrating radar survey, and also something like a LiDAR survey as well. And this is just another example for a project where we were able to use both. But as I said, not there are not a lot of cemeteries that are able to do that, but it's out there for you if it's something you're interested in talking about or considering. So what do you do with all of this stuff that you've done all your research, you've done all this recording? I just wanted to show you all a few examples. I have no specific ties to any of these examples. I just know about them because I've done either research with them or for in their cemeteries, and I'm always looking around for great examples. Going back to what I said about geophysical surveys, you may not be your cemetery steward, your organization may not be in a financial position where you're able to do this. But again, now more than ever, it's a lot easier than it has been in the past. I encourage you to go check some of these out. Historic Oakwood Cemetery in Raleigh, North Carolina, has quite an unbelievable website of their research. It is an active cemetery, so you can actually, they've included a tie-in, if you will, that involves, like, if you're looking for plots, you can find available plots. It's a pretty robust website, as is Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. I encourage you to go and check out. I took a screen grab of this section because it relates to research. So they actually have available on their website burial and vital records from this specific time period. So again, I encourage you to go check that out. And even on an Oklahoma source that I looked at, this is a city, I think it's the city of Marietta. I found so this is the city's website, and there's not a component that is as dynamic as, say, Greenwood or Oakwood. But what they've got down here in the left is a PDF of who's buried in that one specific cemetery. So my point in showing this is to say, you may not be able to have all the bells and whistles right away, or maybe not ever, but it's good to get the information out there. I'm a huge proponent of stuff being available online for numerous reasons that I could talk about for a long period of time, but just get the material together and get it out there. And I always end with this at the end of the day, and all that we're doing with this stuff is do no harm and have a fantastic time doing it. This is my contact information. Please reach out to me. Like I said, I'm sure there's some things that I've probably missed that you wanted me to cover in here, or you've got some things you want to share with me, and I look forward to it. So please reach out to me at any point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was some great information. So there are a few questions that we have that have popped up to me. So the first one says, do you have a cemetery record form that you feel like is really exceptional for recording cemeteries? You gave the example of the one from North Carolina, but do you have any other examples or recommendations?
Yeah, hang on one second. Let me get there's my camera. There is a really good Connecticut that sticks out in my mind, and whoever asked that question, send me an email too. But you can look up. I think I have searched for cemetery survey forms. So if you just Google cemetery survey forms, I remember. I don't remember if it's like their SHPO. I just remember they actually had one. Like theirs is not only a great form because of all the fields that it has. They had fillable it's a fillable form, so you're not having to print it out. Well, I guess you could if you're going to be doing it in the field, but if you wanted to download it, you could fill it out while in the field. So Connecticut just sticks out in my mind. The National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, that's NCPTT. They have a great form. Something else that is available online. And sorry, I'm going to grab something right quick. One of the things to do as part of your survey work, one of the things that I put together for folks who help me do survey work is I basically put together a manual of grave marker types and forms, so that when you're out in the field and you're recording something and you're not sure if it's a pedestal tomb with a vaulted roof, is it a just the various types. Is it a pulpit marker? So, and I didn't mention that, and I should have. I apologize. But this is something you can find online as well. The Chikora Foundation in Charleston, I think in Columbia, South Carolina. Yeah, NCPTT. I know that Chikora has a little booklet that they did years ago on recording historic cemeteries. But there are a lot of great forms. All you really have to do is search cemetery survey forms, and we've been picking and choosing. I found one also. It's I can't remember which county it's in Maryland. There are a lot out there. And I'm sorry not to mention any from the Midwest. Most of our work is on the East Coast, but I'm sure there are others as well. And I know that's not a great answer, but there are a lot. And if you want to follow up with an email, please do, and I can send you an example, because these aren't proprietary, forms as far as I know.
Okay. Well, then to that end, another question that came up: what kind of books would you recommend people read or use to document the marker types? Like, is there a resource out there that would be good for them to read?
Yes. So what I've done with mine, this is my personal copy, and I will tell you, this is not something like I didn't come up with all this that's in here. What I did was and I don't mind sharing it with whoever wants it. We had a project in Massachusetts, and one of the things that we decided to do was to create which is basically, you probably can't see it, but it's grave marker types. We have someone on staff who is great at drawing and graphics. I don't mind sharing that with you. As I mentioned, the Chikora Foundation, they not only have like graphic images of like types of coping around family plots. They have vase types. There are types of fencing. So Chikora is a great resource. There's also a great resource, and I think it's for the state of Georgia. There is a cultural resource management firm, South and Associates. New South, I think that New South did this really big context statement on African American cemeteries in the state of Georgia, and they, in the very back, and I think this is available online. In the very back, they have photographs of all the various grave marker types as part of their context study on African American cemeteries. Now, they don't have grave marker types like, say, in the Mid-Atlantic or New England on the East Coast. Say they have a lot more brownstone than we do in the Southeast. But it's a good place to start. Again, if you weren't able to write all that down, send me an email. But those are some that I use for my personal use. Is New South Study. It's a context statement on African American cemeteries in Georgia. The Chikora Foundation, and then we have one that we created in-house that I don't mind sharing with folks.
Okay. In the chat, if you all haven't noticed, I put the contact in for the tree guy that we use in Oklahoma. So if you have specific questions about trees in your cemetery, he is more than happy to help you out with those kind of questions. Julie posted in the Q&A an explanation about some other resources that you can use in Oklahoma that her grandmother wrote. And so thank you, Julie, for sharing that. The other question that came up was, how do you determine if there are burials outside the fences? So we know that those fences can be installed much later, but how does your company work to find out whether there are burials outside?
So I assume they mean like a church, like an enclosure?
Yeah, an enclosure.
Typically, we typically do ground penetrating radar to determine, let me take that back. We use ground penetrating radar to determine if potential anomalies that we find could be burials, could they be tree roots, things like that. So in one example I showed where we did not use GPR, we used LiDAR, or we did a LiDAR survey, was because the depressions in the cemetery were so deep. We had tried to use, so I guess what I'm getting at is understanding your landscape. So if outside the fence it's heavily wooded with like big mature trees, you can still do GPR to try to determine, because what ends up happening, and a lot of folks on here may know this, is when, say, someone digs a grave, they disturb the soil. Well, unless you have someone looking at that, disturbance to determine, because that same type of disturbance can be created by a tree root. So long answer to your questions, we typically do GPR surveys. And depending on what state, sometimes and I don't know, this will be an interesting question for Oklahoma, is it archaeology related? Are probing surveys permittable in the state? I'm not for novices, but professionally. But that is, some states do also are okay with doing a probing survey in addition to the ground penetrating radar survey.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, although someone did let me know that they couldn't see my note in chat, so I moved it over to the Q&A published section, so you can see that contact for the tree person there. Anybody else have any further questions? Let's see. Doesn't appear so. So with that, I'll let you all know that our last cemetery session will be in November, again, available online. You can register. And just again, thank you, Jason, so much for the information today, and we appreciate your time. We hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.